Tonight, the parents of Austin murder victim professional cyclist Moriah Wilson are suing their daughter's convicted killer. Wilson's murder made national headlines back in 2022, and last fall, Kaitlin Armstrong was convicted of her murder.
Austin, Texas, May 11, 2022. A warm spring night. The kind cyclists dream about. Dry roads, soft wind, the promise of a big race 2 days away. In a quiet East Austin neighborhood, a young woman named Anna Moriah Wilson, known to everyone simply as Mo, was staying at a friend's apartment while she prepared to compete in the Gravel Locos race in Hico, Texas. She had flown in a few days earlier, her bike bag still half unpacked, her race kit laid out for the morning. Mo was 25 years old, and in the world of gravel and mountain biking, she was already a phenomenon. A rider who had gone from promising amateur to podium contender in what felt like the blink of an eye. That evening, Mo had dinner with a friend, went for a swim, and was later dropped off at the apartment where she was staying. It was an ordinary end to an ordinary day. Nobody who saw her that night could have imagined it would be her last. Sometime after she returned home, a person entered the apartment. What followed was fast, violent, and devastating. Mo was shot multiple times. When a friend arrived and found her, there was nothing anyone could do. Austin Travis County EMS pronounced her dead at the scene. The news broke first inside the tight-knit gravel and endurance cycling community, a world small enough that almost everyone had ridden alongside her, raced against her, or watched her rocket up the results sheets in just a few short years. Then it broke everywhere else. For a community that prided itself on trust, on strangers becoming teammates over hundreds of miles of dirt road. The murder of Mo Wilson felt like a rupture. This wasn't supposed to happen to someone like her. Someone whose entire life was built around long training rides, early mornings, and the simple physical joy of pushing a bike up a hill nobody else wanted to climb. Investigators moved quickly. Within hours, detectives from the Austin Police Department's homicide unit were combing through surveillance footage from nearby homes and businesses, piecing together a timeline of vehicles, license plates, and movement on quiet residential streets. What they found didn't point to a stranger, a robbery gone wrong, or a random act of violence. It pointed to someone Mo knew, or more precisely, someone connected to a man Mo knew. That man was Colin Strickland, a professional gravel cyclist himself, and at the time, in an on-again, off-again relationship with a 34-year-old yoga instructor named Kaitlin Armstrong. In the days before the murder, Colin and Mo had spent time together, a dinner, a swim, the kind of casual hangout that happens constantly among athletes who share a sport, a circuit, and often a past. But to Kaitlin Armstrong, according to what investigators would later piece together from witnesses, that friendship was not casual at all. It was, in her eyes, a threat to everything she had. Within days, detectives had identified a vehicle, a Jeep Grand Cherokee registered to Armstrong, caught on camera near the apartment around the time of the shooting. They found a weapon purchase record. They found witnesses who described a woman consumed by jealousy, who had allegedly said in the days before the murder that she wanted to kill the woman she believed was destroying her relationship. None of this was theory. It was the beginning of a case built methodically, piece by piece, that would eventually lead investigators across state lines, across a national border, and into one of the most talked about criminal trials in recent Texas history. But in those first hours, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was a 25-year-old woman, full of talent and promise, lying dead in a home that was supposed to be safe, and a community trying to process a loss that made no sense. This is the story of what happened to Mo Wilson, why it happened, and what happened 4 years later that reopened old wounds and shocked even the people who thought they already knew everything about this case. To understand the scale of what was lost on May 11, 2022, you have to understand who Anna Moriah Wilson actually was, not as a headline, but as a person. Mo grew up in New Hampshire, the daughter of Eric and Karen Wilson. From an early age, she was drawn to the outdoors and to competition, but her path to cycling stardom wasn't a straight line. She had been a competitive alpine ski racer as a teenager, training with an intensity that would later define her cycling career. An injury eventually pushed her away from skiing, and it was during her recovery and search for a new outlet that she discovered road and gravel cycling. She attended Dartmouth College, where she continued to develop as an athlete before making the leap that so many talented amateurs dream about but few ever complete, turning her passion into a professional career. What made Mo's rise remarkable wasn't just her results, although those were extraordinary. In an astonishingly short window of time, she went from relatively unknown to one of the most dominant names in American gravel racing, winning major races and finishing on podiums against riders who had been competing at the elite level for years. She had a rare combination of raw physical talent, an analytical mind trained by years of ski racing, and a work ethic that friends and coaches consistently described as relentless. People in the sport didn't just respect her, they were, in the best sense, a little in awe of her. But those who knew Mo personally often say the same thing. Her talent was almost secondary to who she was as a human being. She was known for her humor, her warmth, and a genuine, easy way of making people feel like her friend within minutes of meeting her. She documented her adventures and training on social media, often with a wry, self-deprecating wit that stood in contrast to the ultra-serious image so many endurance athletes cultivate. She loved dogs, loved her friends fiercely, and had built a life around the sport and the community that came with it. Mo had traveled to Austin, Texas, for the Gravel Locos race, an event that drew top competitors from across the gravel racing circuit. Austin was, in many ways, home turf for the sport. A hub for gravel and endurance cycling culture, filled with athletes, coaches, and race organizers who all moved in overlapping circles. It's part of why her connection, however brief and platonic, to fellow professional cyclist Colin Strickland raised no alarms among her friends. In this world, spending time with fellow athletes wasn't unusual. It was simply how the community functioned. Her death didn't just take a rising star from the sport. It took a daughter, a friend, a training partner, a person whose text messages friends still describe scrolling through, unable to quite believe there wouldn't be another one. In the aftermath, the cycling world organized memorial rides in her honor across the country. An outpouring that reflected not just admiration for her talent, but genuine grief for who she was. It's important to hold on to that image of Mo Wilson as this story moves forward, because everything that follows, the manhunt, the trial, the years of appeals, can start to feel like a legal drama, a procedural. But at the center of it is a 25-year-old woman who had just begun to live the life she'd worked so hard to build, and who never got the chance to finish it. At the heart of this case was a relationship that, according to prosecutors, curdled into obsession and, ultimately, violence. Caitlin Armstrong was, by most public accounts, a yoga instructor living in Austin, in a relationship with Colin Strickland, a professional gravel and road cyclist who had built a modest but respected profile within the endurance cycling world. Their relationship, according to testimony and reporting on the case, had a turbulent history, on again, off again, marked by breakups and reconciliations over a period of years. At one point during a period when Armstrong and Strickland were broken up, Strickland had a brief romantic relationship with Mo Wilson. It didn't last, and by the time of Mo's fatal trip to Austin in May 2022, Strickland and Armstrong were back together. Mo and Strickland's connection, by all accounts from those close to the situation, had settled back into simple friendship. The kind of relationship common among professional athletes who share a small, insular sport. But according to prosecutors, Armstrong never fully let go of what had happened between Strickland and Mo. Witnesses would later testify that Armstrong had expressed intense jealousy and anger about the two remaining friends, and that she had, on more than one occasion, made statements suggesting she wanted to harm Mo. Investigators alleged that in the days leading up to the murder, Armstrong had been closely monitoring Strickland's location and communications, a level of surveillance that friends described as consistent with a pattern of controlling, jealous behavior in the relationship. On the night of the murder, Strickland had dinner with Mo and another friend, and the group went swimming afterward. An entirely innocent evening among people who shared a sport and a social circle. Strickland then dropped Mo off at the apartment where she was staying. According to the prosecution's timeline, it was sometime after this drop-off that Armstrong arrived at the property. What makes this chapter of the story so difficult isn't just the violence that followed, it's the mundanity of what preceded it. Nothing about that dinner, that swim, or that friendly drop-off suggested anything sinister was unfolding. To Mo, and seemingly to Strickland, it was just another night among friends in a sport built on exactly that kind of camaraderie. The tragedy is that an entirely ordinary evening became, in the eyes of another person, the final piece of evidence in a story she had already decided was true. One where she was being wronged, and where jealousy had curdled into something far darker than heartbreak. Prosecutors would go on to argue that this jealousy was not an isolated flash of anger, but the culmination of a pattern. One that ended with Armstrong allegedly purchasing a handgun in the days before the shooting. A detail that would become central to the case against her. The love triangle, as tabloids so often reduce these stories, was in reality something far more serious in the eyes of investigators. A sustained pattern of obsession that, according to the state of Texas, ended in a calculated act of violence against a woman who had done nothing more than be friends with the wrong person at the wrong time. In the hours and days following Mo Wilson's death, Austin Police Department homicide detectives began assembling a case with a speed that would later prove critical. Investigators pulled surveillance footage from homes and businesses near the crime scene, tracing a vehicle's movements in the hours surrounding the shooting. That vehicle, a Jeep Grand Cherokee, was registered to Caitlin Armstrong. Detectives also obtained records showing that Armstrong had purchased a firearm just days before the murder, a detail investigators considered highly significant given the timeline of events. Detectives interviewed those close to Armstrong and Strickland, gathering accounts that painted a picture of a woman gripped by jealousy and suspicion in the weeks leading up to the shooting. According to reporting on the case, some witnesses described Armstrong as having tracked Strickland's phone and having grown increasingly agitated about his continued friendship with Mo. Within days, police felt they had enough to act. Officers located and arrested Armstrong, but due to a discrepancy involving the specific warrant used, she was released shortly afterward. Before homicide detectives had finalized the murder charge against her, it was a procedural gap that would have enormous consequences. By the time investigators were prepared to formally charge her with murder, Caitlin Armstrong was no longer in Texas. This detail remains one of the most agonizing parts of the case for those following it closely. Law enforcement had, at one point, physically had Armstrong in custody, only to release her due to a technical issue with an unrelated warrant. It's the kind of near miss that true crime cases are built on. A moment where, had circumstances aligned only slightly differently, the entire subsequent manhunt might never have happened. Once detectives realized the depth of evidence pointing to Armstrong, the vehicle footage, the recently purchased firearm, and witness accounts of jealousy and threats, they moved to formally charge her with first-degree murder. But by then, Armstrong had already fled. Investigators later determined she had first traveled to New York, staying briefly with contacts there, before making arrangements to leave the country entirely. The gap between her release and the formal murder charge gave Armstrong a head start that authorities would spend the next 6 weeks trying to close. U.S. Marshals joined the investigation, treating it as a fugitive case with international implications. What had started as a local homicide investigation in Austin, Texas, was rapidly becoming a national story, one that combined the emotional weight of a young athlete's murder with the drama of an active manhunt for a suspect who had seemingly vanished. For Mo Wilson's family and friends, this chapter of the story brought a particular kind of anguish. Not just grief over her death, but the agonizing uncertainty of not knowing whether the person responsible would ever be found and held accountable. That uncertainty would define the next month and a half of the case. As U.S. Marshals and Austin police widened their search, they discovered that Caitlin Armstrong had not simply run, she had planned an elaborate disappearance. investigators found that Armstrong had used her sister Christine's passport to leave the United States, boarding a flight out of the country under her sister's identity. It was a bold and legally significant choice. Identity fraud combined with international flight from a murder charge signaled to investigators a level of premeditation that went beyond a panicked reaction. But the most striking detail to emerge during the search was almost cinematic in its specificity. Authorities determined that Armstrong had undergone plastic surgery during her time on the run, altering her appearance in an apparent attempt to more closely resemble her sister, whose passport she was using. She had also reportedly gotten a haircut and taken other steps to change her look. This wasn't someone running blindly. This was someone attempting a sustained, calculated effort to erase her old identity and disappear permanently. Reporting on the case at the time noted the surreal combination of details: a yoga instructor with no prior serious criminal history, allegedly capable of not just fleeing the country on a stolen identity, but of researching and undergoing cosmetic surgery specifically to make that stolen identity more convincing. It added a layer to the case that captivated true crime audiences and mainstream news outlets alike. This wasn't just an alleged murder. It was an alleged murder followed by an audacious, well-resourced escape. Investigators traced Armstrong's movements from New York toward Central America, following a trail of financial transactions, border crossing records, and tips from the public as her case gained national media attention. The FBI's 10 Most Wanted style publicity around the case, combined with a substantial reward for information leading to her capture, kept the story in headlines for weeks. For Mo Wilson's grieving family, this period was particularly excruciating. Every day that passed without an arrest meant another day of watching a story about their daughter's murder unfold not as a resolved tragedy, but as an ongoing international manhunt with no clear end in sight. Meanwhile, across the cycling world, athletes who had known and raced with Mo organized memorial events, processed their grief publicly, and watched the news for any sign that justice might eventually catch up with the woman investigators believed was responsible. What makes this chapter of the story so unsettling isn't just the audacity of the escape. It's what it revealed about the gap between the person Armstrong had presented to the world as a yoga instructor building a peaceful, wellness-oriented life, and the calculated, resourceful behavior authorities say she exhibited once she became a fugitive. It was a contrast that would follow the case all the way through trial, the disconnect between how Armstrong was described by friends and family and what prosecutors alleged she was capable of. The search for Kaitlin Armstrong became one of the most closely watched fugitive manhunts in recent memory, stretching across 6 weeks in multiple countries. U.S. Marshals, working alongside Austin police and international law enforcement partners, tracked financial and travel records that suggested Armstrong had made her way to Costa Rica. The Marshals Service placed Armstrong on its 15 Most Wanted list, a designation reserved for fugitives considered particularly dangerous or difficult to locate, and offered a reward for information leading to her arrest. Investigators believe Armstrong spent much of her time as a fugitive attempting to blend into local life in Costa Rica, reportedly staying at hostels and taking surf lessons. Activities that, on the surface, painted the picture of a relaxed traveler rather than someone accused of first-degree murder and actively evading an international manhunt. This detail struck many following the case as almost unbearably jarring. While Mo Wilson's family and friends were living through unimaginable grief, the woman accused of killing her was, according to reports, taking surfing lessons on a Central American beach. The 43 days between Armstrong's disappearance and her eventual capture tested the patience and resources of every agency involved. Marshals worked with informants, examined financial transactions tied to Armstrong's known aliases, and coordinated with Costa Rican authorities on potential locations. Tips poured in from the public, some credible, many not, as the case's media coverage intensified across the United States. For investigators, the challenge wasn't just geographic, it was the fact that Armstrong had taken deliberate steps to change her appearance and travel under a false identity, making even confirmed location tips difficult to act on with certainty. Every piece of surveillance footage, every hostel registration, Every eyewitness account had to be cross-referenced against a woman who no longer looked quite like the photos investigators had circulated. Throughout this period, the case remained a fixture of national news coverage, driven by a combination of factors that rarely converge in a single story. The murder of a rising athletic star, an alleged love triangle motive, an international fugitive flight, and now a manhunt spanning multiple countries. True crime podcasts, cable news segments, and true crime forums dissected every new detail as it emerged, while Mo Wilson's family largely stayed out of the spotlight, focused on grieving privately even as their daughter's case became a national phenomenon. The manhunt would ultimately end not with a dramatic standoff but with a quieter, more procedural conclusion, one that came after weeks of mounting pressure, cross-border cooperation, and, eventually, a tip that gave authorities the location they needed. After 43 days on the run, the manhunt for Kaitlin Armstrong came to an end in Santa Teresa, Costa Rica, a small surf town on the Pacific coast that had in the weeks prior unknowingly become her hideout. U.S. Marshals, working with Costa Rican law enforcement and Interpol, tracked Armstrong to a hostel in the area. According to reporting at the time, Armstrong had been living under an assumed identity, blending into the transient community of surfers and travelers who moved through Santa Teresa, a town known more for its laid-back beach culture than international manhunts. When authorities located her, Armstrong reportedly did not resist arrest. The end of the search, after weeks of national media coverage and mounting public interest, was almost anticlimactic in its execution. A quiet arrest in a beach town, closing out a case that had, until that point, unfolded with the drama of a thriller. Armstrong was taken into custody by Costa Rican authorities and processed for extradition back to the United States to face the first-degree murder charge waiting for her in Texas, along with charges related to the identity fraud involved in her flight from the country. The extradition process itself took additional time, working through the legal frameworks governing the transfer of a fugitive from Costa Rica back to face charges in the American justice system. When Armstrong finally returned to Texas in custody, it marked the end of one chapter of the case and the beginning of another, a long, often delayed path toward trial that would take well over a year to reach its conclusion. For Mo Wilson's family, the capture brought a measure of relief after more than 6 weeks of uncertainty. But it was tempered by the knowledge that the legal process ahead would be lengthy, difficult, and would require them to relive the details of their daughter's death repeatedly in a public courtroom. News of the capture spread quickly, closing out one of the most closely followed fugitive searches in recent memory and shifting public attention toward the question that had been building since the case first broke. Would Kaitlin Armstrong be convicted for the murder of Mo Wilson? And if so, what price would she pay? The answer to that question would not come quickly. What followed was a series of delays, legal maneuvers, and one additional, deeply strange twist that added yet another layer to a case that already felt almost too dramatic to be real. Kaitlin Armstrong's trial did not proceed on any kind of ordinary timeline. Multiple delays pushed the case back repeatedly, extending the wait for Mo Wilson's family and the broader public well beyond a year after her capture. Then, while awaiting trial in custody, Armstrong did something that shocked even those who had followed every twist of the case up to that point. She attempted to escape from jail. According to court documents, Armstrong appeared to have planned her escape attempt carefully. She reportedly complained of an injury in order to secure an outside medical appointment and separately made a request to restrict the use of her leg restraints, ostensibly for medical reasons. Officers investigating the incident also found a broken metal pin inside her cell, the kind of object that could potentially be used to manipulate handcuffs. Taken together, authorities allege this amounted to a calculated attempt to create an opportunity for escape from custody. The escape attempt resulted in an additional charge, escape causing bodily injury, a second-degree felony carrying a potential sentence of up to 20 years. Layered on top of the murder charge she already faced. For a case that had already involved international flight, a stolen identity and cosmetic surgery to evade capture. The revelation of an attempted jailhouse escape felt to many observers like confirmation of just how far Armstrong seemed willing to go to avoid facing consequences for Mo Wilson's death. When the trial finally began, prosecutors laid out the case methodically, the surveillance footage placing Armstrong's vehicle near the crime scene, the recently purchased handgun, witness testimony describing her jealousy and threats in the weeks before the murder, and the extensive evidence of her flight, the stolen passport, the plastic surgery, the international manhunt, and the jailhouse escape attempt that followed. Defense attorneys worked to challenge elements of the prosecution's timeline and evidence, but the cumulative weight of the case, investigation, flight, and alleged attempted escape from custody presented jurors with a narrative that was difficult to counter. Testimony from friends and family on both sides added emotional weight to an already heavy courtroom. Witnesses described Mo Wilson's talent and warmth, while others testified to a different side of Kaitlin Armstrong than the one her friends knew. One marked, according to prosecutors, by obsessive jealousy that escalated into lethal violence. After a trial delayed by years and punctuated by the shocking revelation of an attempted jailhouse escape, the case moved toward its conclusion, a verdict the public and Mo Wilson's grieving family had waited more than a year and a half to hear. On November 16, 2023, a Travis County jury found Kaitlin Armstrong guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Anna Moriah Wilson. The following day, after roughly 3.5 hours of deliberation, notably longer than the time it took jurors to reach a guilty verdict, the jury sentenced Armstrong to 90 years in prison. Under Texas law, she would be eligible for parole only after serving 30 years, meaning she would not be eligible for release until she was well into her 60s. Outside the courthouse, Eric Wilson, Mo's father, addressed reporters with words that captured the emotional weight of the moment, describing it not as an occasion for celebration, but as a time to reflect on how deeply dishonesty and betrayal can devastate lives, and expressing hope that his family could now begin the process of healing after more than 18 months of grief compounded by a prolonged legal battle. During the trial's punishment phase, testimony grew tense as witnesses close to Armstrong described her, in some cases, as a caring, empathetic person. Descriptions that stood in stark contrast to the actions prosecutors had just spent weeks proving in court. At one point, when a witness who identified herself as Armstrong's best friend described her as a loving, caring, beautiful bright light, the prosecutor directly challenged her, asking whether she understood that the woman she was describing had been convicted of murdering Mo Wilson. The witness, visibly caught between loyalty and the reality of the verdict, acknowledged that she respected the jury's decision. The 90-year sentence effectively meant that, barring a successful appeal, Kaitlin Armstrong would spend the remainder of her functional adult life in prison. She was transferred to the Dr. Lane Murray Unit, a women's correctional facility in Gatesville, Texas, where she remains incarcerated, with parole eligibility not arriving until the early 2050s. For a case that had captivated national attention through its combination of celebrity-adjacent athletic drama, an international manhunt, cosmetic surgery, and a stunning jailhouse escape attempt, the verdict and sentencing offered something the story had been building toward for a year and a half: accountability. But as is so often the case in the American justice system, a conviction and sentence are rarely the true final chapter. Kaitlin Armstrong's legal team was not finished fighting, and what came next, years later, would reopen the case in ways almost nobody following it expected. For most true crime cases, a 90-year sentence would be the end of the story. For Kaitlin Armstrong, it was merely the start of a new, quieter legal battle, one that would culminate, 4 years after Mo Wilson's murder, in a development that reignited public attention on the case. In December 2023, just weeks after her sentencing, Armstrong's legal team filed a motion seeking a new trial. The basis of the motion was startling. Armstrong's attorneys alleged that she had been pregnant at the time of her arrest in Costa Rica, and that she likely miscarried while in custody. An affidavit from Armstrong's father, submitted as part of the filing, stated his belief that his daughter had been pregnant during this period. The defense argued that this circumstance should have been presented to the jury as mitigating evidence during the sentencing phase of her trial. Evidence that, had it been known, might have influenced jurors toward a less severe sentence. The claim added an unexpected emotional and legal dimension to a case many believed had already reached its conclusion. Armstrong's team requested an evidentiary hearing to formally examine the pregnancy claim and its relevance to sentencing, but in August 2024, that request was denied. Weeks later, in September 2024, Armstrong's attorneys escalated the fight, petitioning the Texas Third Court of Appeals to review the lower court's decision not to grant an evidentiary hearing. For more than a year, the appeal sat before the appellate court, a quiet legal process unfolding largely outside public view while the broader world moved on from the headlines of 2022 and 2023. Then, in January 2026, nearly 4 years after Mo Wilson's murder, the Third Court of Appeals issued its ruling. The court affirmed Armstrong's conviction, finding no reversible error in her original trial. Her bid for a new trial, built around the pregnancy and mitigating evidence argument, was rejected. The twist that followed wasn't a reversal or a release. It was something almost more unsettling in its finality. Confirmation that despite years of appeals, procedural challenges, and a deeply personal claim about a pregnancy and miscarriage in custody, the original verdict and 90-year sentence would stand. For a case defined by dramatic, almost unbelievable turns. The international flight, the plastic surgery, the jailhouse escape attempt, the resolution of the appeal was comparatively quiet, but no less significant. It closed as definitively as the legal system allows, the last major avenue Armstrong had to overturn her conviction. In the months that followed, the case returned to the public consciousness in a new way. Netflix released The Truth and Tragedy of Moriah Wilson, a documentary revisiting the case in full, drawing on the original 2022 magazine feature that first told Mo's story to a wider audience. Around the same time, Mo Wilson's parents, Karen and Eric Wilson, filed a wrongful death civil lawsuit against Armstrong, seeking a form of accountability that exists separately from the criminal justice system. One aimed at ensuring Armstrong could never financially benefit from her crime, and one that gave the family another avenue to have their daughter's story heard. Today, Caitlin Armstrong remains behind bars at the Dr. Lane Murray unit in Gatesville, Texas, her appeals exhausted, her parole eligibility still decades away. And Mo Wilson, the rising star, the friend, the daughter whose life was cut short in an ordinary Austin apartment on an ordinary spring night, remains, 4 years later, at the center of a story that continues to remind the world how quickly obsession and jealousy can turn devastating, and how long the search for justice can take, even after a verdict has already been reached.